Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Menendez.
Thank you. Let me thank the chairman for indulging, keeping the hearing open, and thank you as the ranking member for staying. I know you have other issues to deal, but for over 250,000 New Jerseyans, this is an incredibly important program. So I just have a couple other questions. Currently, FEMA can deny funds to repair the foundation of a structure if it determines the foundation was damaged due to what is called earth movement rather than by floodwaters. This is the case even though the floodwaters likely caused the earth movement that damaged or destroyed the foundation. We had a lot of arbitrary decisions that all of a sudden there was a denial of for policyholders because there was earth movement, but the earth never moved until the flood came. And so countless claims were denied, and it led to disparate results since the determination of whether the damage was caused by flood or earth movement is unclear and difficult to assess. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Wright, that this is an area that needs a better definition, as technical as it is? Because it just seems to have been used arbitrarily, capriciously a fair number of times.
It is a point that would benefit from far more clarity. Frankly, for me, the distinction here is whether or not it was a pre-existing condition to the structure. And so I acknowledge this earth movement term causes a lot of confusion. When you look at the specifics of how we are directed to implement this, from an indemnification perspective, I only pay for a claim that was caused. And so if the floodwaters caused any kind of structural movement, we should pay. And if this is a 70-year-old home that has settled over the preceding 70 years and has cracks in the foundation that precede the flood event, well, then I shouldn't pay for that. That's not a coverage that was included under the standard flood insurance policy.
All right. So I appreciate that distinction, but making it clear is going to be critically important because there are many people which didn't have cracks in their foundations before, but suddenly they were denied based upon this. So it's something I'd like to work on with you all as
you have my commitment.
Have reauthorization. I appreciate that. Now, I'm glad to hear that you embrace the independent advocate. It's something that I helped create.
You did.
And would it be fair to say that the reforms that FEMA undertook, both with your predecessor and you, as a result to the appeal process, is something that you would embrace incorporating into a new reauthorization?
So the appeals process that is there is something that I would embrace codifying. I think that clearly it was authorities, even go back to 2004, that created this. The way it was implemented, as I've spoken to you in the past, was insufficient and did not have sufficient credibility. From where I sat, we made those changes. I think they're proving beneficial, but codifying that so that any future person who's leading this program wouldn't be able to change that makes sense.
I appreciate that because as a result of our work, in the aftermath of Sandy and the denial of many claimants, I think we came to a better process and a fairer process, and it is something that I'd like to see incorporated in the final new legislation. So, let me ask you one last question. The NFIP has borrowed nearly $25 billion to pay claims for large disasters, $17 billion from Katrina. And I think one of the things we never mention here is the fact that about $10 billion of that debt was incurred by a cause of the Army Corps' levee failure during Katrina. So I don't understand why current policyholders should pay for that mistake. It's the mistake of another federal agency that has a tremendous burden on this program. So it's something to be considered here because you're now paying, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, about $400 million in interest on the debt last year alone, which is over 10% of the premiums that you receive on an annual basis. That $400 million paid by policyholders, real people who are struggling to afford their flood insurance, is there? Do you not believe that that we should be looking at how that debt is dealt with, especially in the fact that so much of it is caused to the errors of another federal entity? How much would premiums have to increase, for example, in order to pay down the debt?
Right. So there is no practical way for us to pay the nearly $25 billion in debt. Full stop. If I was to do that with premium holders, I'd have to make an exponential shift in premiums in order to make that happen. And you are correct. As we look back, nearly $10 billion of that loss in Katrina we can attribute to those levee failures. And you are also correct about the interest, because ultimately I'm not positioned to make principal payments, but I'm required to service that debt. So I have a generally favorable interest rate with the Treasury. The combined about 1.6% is what my interest rate is today. But as interest rates go up, that continues to be a burden. And it is not just $400 million a year. I look over the last dozen years, we're approaching $4 billion that we have paid simply servicing the debt. Those are dollars I simply take out of my premium revenues and transfer. That burden alone is to the point by which my recent borrowing in January included borrowing so that I could make my interest payment this month.
So in essence, Mr. Chairman, what we're doing is we are paying ourselves interest on a debt that we have largely created, in great part by the levee failures, $10 billion right there alone. And so instead of having this type of money either be invested in the program or ultimately reducing the debt, we are paying interest to ourselves, because it's the federal government, FEMA, paying the Treasury at the end of the day. So it's pretty amazing to me that when I borrow, if I lend myself money and then I ultimately pay myself interest, that normally doesn't happen. We're robbing from Peter to pay Paul, but unfortunately it's the policyholders that get affected here at the end of the day. So I appreciate your insight to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Mr. Wright, thank you for your testimony and your public